he's had over 2 days to recover. He got back on Friday, too, and he still sounds like somebody took a cheese grater to his throat.
Let me tell you what, I am sympathetic. As Buck mentioned, this is my first combine this last weekend, and I get it. Good Lord, do I get it.
That's
Never
racist.
seen anything like this. I had a buddy of mine who's in coaching text me last year and say, this seems like college for a lot of people. And walking into Prime 47 at midnight and feeling the wave of heat hit me and that sticky feeling beneath my feet, I felt like I was back at the linebacker in South Bend. It was amazing.
It's like our spring break. It's the NFL spring break at this point in time, or it was. And I think a lot of people, including myself, are too quick to take advantage of that. Also, a lot of those bars happen to be my college bars, Mike, because I went to Indiana, Bloomington, and the original Kilroy's right down the road, so why not carry that over? It's just always a bad week for me that way. But it's a good week for a lot of players. It's a good week for coaches and organizations trying to get their stuff together ahead of the NFL draft. And, of course, free agency will come first in just, 9 days from now. The new league year will be upon us. Given that it was your first combine experience, what, I guess, lived up to expectations that you might have had, and what was different going in that you expected?
Yeah, I think for all of the focus on the field, which certainly is the thing that matters, second to the interviews behind the scenes that none of us get to see, right? You're hearing bits and pieces from what players say about who they met with officially, what team personnel that you might talk to said about guys that they had a chance to catch up with. But obviously, that physical part on field has always been the sell. I think for me, the part I enjoyed the most, to your point, getting to go out there with Bleacher Report and do some interviews that were used in a live show they were a part of, is just getting to see how these guys respond and talk ball in a setting where they're inundated with it. They're going up on these podiums and talking. They're talking behind their closed doors in the meetings. They've been coached how to do this in the way I know you are during the pre-draft process, but to still hear how some guys acquitted themselves and what that can at times indicate on a guy's football maturity, the way that they approach the game, and who it left you coming away impressed with tied to the workouts. Like Jahdae Barron, one of the stories of the weekend, performed incredibly well. That 4.4 matched the tape that a lot of people saw. But hearing him, he reeks of the maturity of a player that had to wait a little bit longer to get to the point where he was going to be considered a day one draft pick. A guy that developed a lot over the last 3 years. Hearing his classmate Kelvin Banks in this draft class out of Texas talk specifically about deficiencies in his game that he knows he's got to work on going to the next level. Those are the kind of things that, as we're trying to figure out who's got the aptitude to come in and digest what we're throwing at them, take that criticism and work with it, that I thought really impressed me in terms of a part of the process I had undersold.
Mike Golick Jr. is hanging out here, recapping the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis on 104.5 The Zone.
Mike, as a former offensive lineman, how naturally do you gravitate towards watching and talking about the O-line at the Combine, especially this tackle class, which is particularly interesting, and Titans obviously have a major need at right tackle?
Yeah, no, I always you go with what you know, right? And I think the familiarity with what these guys are asked to do, what the specific points of the position are that are going to matter at the next level, all that stuff, you can't help it. And selfishly for me, I like watching guys, and I don't know how you guys are with sports, I like watching guys that are way better than I could have ever conceived of being. Like, some people love an underdog story. The guy that grinded his whole career to get there might be a little bit under. I want to see the freaks of nature that go out there and far exceed anything I was going to put on tape. And this class certainly has one of those guys. Armand Membu had a really big weekend in terms of testing incredibly well in that regard. So it's an interesting class because with so many of the top guys, we've already had I call it the Zoolander slashy conversation, where it's always a tackle in college, but maybe we'll kick him down to guard. Doesn't necessarily speak to it as highly as last year's tackle class, but I do think there are a lot of really good, productive starters in this class, and a lot of those guys, Tyler Booker on the interior, all showed really well for themselves this weekend at the Combine.
Look at you acting like Lucas or I have a shred of athleticism, like all of these players are not leaps and bounds better than us at anything that we would have ever just even thought about trying to accomplish athletically, Mark.
And listen, you guys give off the vibes of a very athletic show, but It is.
Thank you.
Everyone's got those, I think, different ways they come to the game. And I always do appreciate the guys that are incredibly gifted, because it's a fine line with offensive line in the NFL too. And I think this is the interesting part of this tackle class is I was just watching Membu, and there are lots of things to like, but there are also things that are imperfect. And it's how much as an NFL team do you know you're capable of? Like the Eagles and Jeff Stoutland are a perfect example. They get to move different than 90% of the league. The Titans, because of Bill Callahan, get to move differently than 90% of the league, because when you've got a proven developer, you can look a little bit more at traits. You can look a little bit more at a guy with high athletic upside who probably just needs to be coached on a couple of the finer points. Other teams, that's not necessarily the case. And if you want to get caught up on traits and arm length and all this stuff that doesn't match production necessarily, you're going to get yourself in trouble if you don't have an actual coach that can handle it in the building and a program to develop these guys at a time in the NFL's history where there's less on-field time for this unnatural position than ever before.
The NFL, I think, Mike, has done a lot better adapting the drills specific to positions that they're going to put these guys through. And, some still have a greater level of relevancy than others, and not all of them necessarily translate. Obviously, you still have to be technically sound. You still have to have skill at what you're doing beyond being able to, lift heavy weights and run fast and jump high, though those things, of course, do matter. Drills that are most relevant to you as a former offensive lineman, collegiate, and I know you had a couple of cups of coffee in the pros at a couple of training camps and things like that, versus what you kind of put off to the side and be like, yeah, okay, maybe that guy didn't perform at the highest of heights in this particular drill, but that drill is not going to be a defining thing for him as to whether, for example, this is a third-round pick or a fifth-round pick.
Yeah, I think for me, they have done a good job of morphing, particularly the offensive lines on field drills to stuff. I really enjoyed the one. It was kind of like the mimic a screen, get them out in the open field and see how well they move once they're out there, what they look like change of direction wise on the roof, all that stuff that mimics an actual play. And so I think for that, I want to see the change of direction stuff that they do with some of the bag drills there. Obviously, the wave drill is one it's fun to look at. It's fun to watch. But to me, the mirror drill where you're asked to pivot on a dime when you're trying to pass off, almost like mimicking passing off a stunt in the bags where they'll have you hit one slide, come back inside. All those things, to me, that's the kind of stuff that I want to see that, hey, maybe depending on what spot you played on the line or what level you played at or the kind of competition, maybe you didn't see as much of that, or maybe you just want to see it relative to their peers on the field of how a guy moves laterally, where he puts his weight in his stance when he's going to the outside here, how easily he's able to change direction. To me, those are all things that I want to know, especially for this tackle class in terms of what I can expect against high-level guys in the perimeter at the next level. So I think overall, listen, we've already all heard, the 40, stuff like that with offensive linemen. You're going to take it with a grain of salt. You're going to look at the 10, but I do think a lot of the on-field bag drills have gotten to the point where it's, all right, I'm actually going to watch you do this. Harry Heastand, who I played with at Notre Dame, was always huge on, I don't need the sleds and the boards and all this stuff. That's not out there on the field with you when you're playing actual football. I want everything we do in practice to replicate an exact movement of the game, and I think we're getting closer to that with the drills every year.
Mike, unsurprisingly, Matt Stafford will remain in L.A. That was a big takeaway, big news out of the week in Indianapolis. So as we look to that first domino that's going to fall, where does Aaron Rodgers even rank for you in the importance level, just in terms of the quarterbacks that are going to make some sort of movement this offseason? It's strange because we've obviously talked about him ad nauseum, but it also feels like there's a chance here that he may not end up mattering that much overall in the quarterback market.
Yeah, I think especially given what we know, unless Aaron Rodgers is all of a sudden going to change the way he moves away from the field and how that would affect your building, especially for a guy that's like at best bridge quarterback or holdover because you don't have any other option here. He's probably, he's well behind Sam Darnold, which is a hilarious thing to just say in general as a statement around football. But well behind Sam Darnold in this conversation, probably behind Russell Wilson and Kirk Cousins. Now, the Cousins one is a little different because based on the way Atlanta's posturing, it doesn't look like they're going to cut him. They've had that money earmarked in the quarterback room for the next 3 years. And so keeping him on the backup as a backup, unless someone's going to pry him out with draft capital, to me is probably something I would brace for in this market. But yeah, Aaron is probably third, fourth down the list in terms of guys that I want in my building. It would take a specific type of building and team culture, a specific type of locker room, and likely a conversation with Aaron about, hey, what's this going to be like? Am I going to have to think about you going on McAfee every Tuesday and saying something? I know the Jets denied that was a part of their conversation, but I don't think that's an absurd thing to bring up when you're talking about this position and where Aaron Rodgers is at this point in his career skill set wise.
I couldn't ever imagine myself covering the Tennessee Titans in the year 2025 and turning my nose up at Aaron Rodgers, Mike, but that's where I am. Like, I just think I don't know him personally, but everything around him, the energy is just so bad. It's so bad. And this is an organization that has a clear and obvious need at quarterback. Basically, anybody could come in here and upgrade the level of quarterback that they received, and yet I am just so uninterested in seeing him come in here and nor do I think that they're legitimately considering it. I don't think Brian Callahan, a coach coming off his first year in a 3-14 campaign and the worst team in football, would be comfortable tying himself to the anchor that is 40-plus-year-old Aaron Rodgers at this point in time. But I can't wrap my head around what you're saying, even though that's the reality.
It is. I wonder when that flips, because Aaron Rodgers towards the end of the season, to speak to the other side of this, was singing a markedly different tune when all of a sudden, faced with his football mortality in general, faced with his mortality with the Jets, of saying, I'm willing to mentor and be a part of helping a younger guy here. I'm willing. It was the first time we had seen something in the vein of Aaron Rodgers acquiescing to the needs of the others on the team, the others in management, and a different plan in the team beyond just, here's the keys to the organization, go do what you need to do. We've waved bye-bye to that. And so if Aaron Rodgers is now going to carry that mentality forward and is willing to maybe take more of a back seat or to acquiesce to the other people in the building, at some point, it's going to tilt the other way this offseason as desperation sets in, because we have talked about the game of musical chairs around quarterbacks this offseason. A, does not have a lot of compelling answers, but B, just has more chairs than it does people at the dance at this point. And so at some point, someone's going to take a chance on Aaron Rodgers. It's just a matter of, will this process and the way that overall it's humbling a guy that's one of the best players we've ever seen at the position, will it change the way that he approaches whatever the next opportunity is? Because I still think he's going to get one.
To your point about the musical chairs, that's what makes this such a fascinating offseason to cover. This is the most interesting Titans offseason I've ever been a part of, and if for no other reason, Mike, but then there's no clear and obvious path forward for them in 2025 at the very least. So given that they currently are in possession of the number 1 overall pick, and you don't even have to make it about the player that you draft if you don't want it to go that route, but philosophically, how do you view them, where they are in their timeline right now, relative to what this draft offers, understanding that free agency will come in first and help us fill in a lot of these gaps? Because I'm just so split, and basically everybody that I talked to this week in Indianapolis was also split. I understand that fans are desperate for a quarterback, especially with the number 1 overall pick. We've been, I wouldn't say fighting that battle for the last couple of months, but just having that conversation at the very least, being like, hey guys, if there was a clear and consensus number 1 overall pick at quarterback, doesn't necessarily mean that they would be a future Hall of Famer, but like we would know that prior to the combine, so that the NFL is as split as the conversation seems to be. I wonder how you kind of view everything within the prism of the Titans.
I think the way that this offseason is set up and where the Titans sit right now requires honesty and patience, because to your point, coming off an awful opening stanza for Brian Callahan and this group, it's not going to get as better in a hurry as you'd like it to avoid hot seat conversation in most circumstances. But if we look at this in totality, I think taking a beat and saying, all right, we have a chance to meaningfully improve and strengthen other areas of this roster. I think that if you get a team like Cleveland or like New York or even like Las Vegas that's somehow truly desperate in a draft class where we all kind of say, hey, it'd probably be ill-advised to spend a ton of resources to go up for one of these quarterbacks. I don't view either of them as a consensus number 1. I don't view either of them as one worthy of those kind of assets, even though they're both going to be top 10 draft picks. If I was Tennessee, I would take Abdul Carter. As long as that stress event or whatever they call it, that's not a stress fracture and that sounds like, according to his representation, reaction, that's the word, won't prevent him from working out at his pro day and won't be a factor. If all of that ends up true and you can check those boxes medically, I'd make him the number 1 overall pick in the draft. As someone that watched him beat the hell out of my favorite team with one arm in that game against Notre Dame in the playoffs, I am an Abdul Carter believer. Was the moment I saw that guy his freshman year when I had a chance to cover Penn State in Happy Valley. And so I would do that, but it also would have to come with the understanding that you're right. Quarterback is going to be an imperfect answer no matter what this offseason. And so you've got to kind of understand as an organization, we're going to take our lumps. And that's easy to say at the beginning of the season, cough, cough, Las Vegas last year, and a lot harder once you get through the season and deal with all the tails that come off of losing at that level, potentially for the second year in a row.
Well, it's interesting to look at two of the potential trade partners that you mentioned there, the Giants and the Raiders, both deemed to be in the Matthew Stafford sweepstakes. He remains in L.A. The Giants, you've got an owner who publicly is saying, yeah, my patience is running pretty thin on the GM and head coach that he retained. And with the Raiders, you've got a head coach that'll be 74 come week 1. Both of those rosters need a lot of work, Mike. Where do you think there is more of an urgency to this phrase, irks a lot of people in Nashville, but for a competitive rebuild in 2025 between New York and Vegas?
Yeah, I think Vegas would be the one if you're looking for that's capable of it. Like the Giants, I think you're caught between worlds in a way that's always dangerous. Like this was the same concern you had last year, and that was in the best of circumstances for it. Caleb Williams is the guy that we look at as the consensus number 1. And you do have all these fun receivers, and in the background, we're all going, well, in hindsight, I didn't put enough emphasis on the offensive line. That ended up being one of the things that ultimately damned them. But the thing I did constantly point to is, you were ready to fire Matt Eberflus at the end of last year, it felt like, and now you're going to bring him back and hope that, hey, shuffling the bag at quarterback is going to be enough to make this happen, and Shane Waldron's going to be your answer, and none of the coaching part of it felt tenable, and that's the danger here in New York is you might potentially bring in a rookie into an environment that seems deeply unhealthy given the tension that's going to exist inherently there. Yeah, you got Malik Neighbors, and that certainly gives you the way to go, but Las Vegas has Brock Bowers on offense. You've both got compelling young weapons that are going to give whoever's at quarterback a better chance than they would have had a year ago this time, at least on paper, it felt like. But I would just say Las Vegas because you're starting fresh. Pete Carroll has done this before. He's done it at a high level before. He's done it in college and the NFL. And so he at least is walking in going, all right, I know where things need to go. For Brian Daboll, with the exception of one season as a head coach, we haven't really seen that. And so now having to go on that adventure again, either with Sam Darnold or with one of the rookie quarterbacks, feels a lot more perilous to me.
He is Mike Golick Jr. He is marked safe from his first NFL Combine. You can check him out on DraftKings. He was doing great work in Indianapolis for Bleacher Report throughout the course of the week. Mike, thank you for coming on, as always, and making us smarter and also making me look infinitely less professional because I sound like I can't handle my liquor after a week in Indy, and you're doing all of this pristinely.
Look, you know what? If I can say this, Buck, I think to me, you sound wonderful. I always have thought you had one of those golden voices that just gets better when you add a little bit of smoke and booze on top of it. So I think you're in a great spot here. Don't let them get to you. You're doing great, buddy.
I wish I had that level of confidence. That's Mike Golick Jr. there with us on 104.5 The Zone. Always good to see Gojo, certainly in Indy, and happy to have him as a part of the show. So there's a lot to react to there because I think his Bears comparison, like bringing back Matt Eberflus and the detriment that we all understood that to be and ultimately ended up playing itself out. I don't think that's a similar situation to Brian Callahan here necessarily, but it does give you some food for thought. And also
it's certainly more similar to the Giants situation.
I would agree. We will take a quick break from football because there was a tremendous basketball result over the weekend. It's always tremendous when the state of Alabama can hold a fat old L in Jemai Meshack.